welcome to another episode of CTRMRadio, a podcast from Commodity Technology Advisory. And I'm Gary Vasey, your host today. For this episode, we'll be talking to Aviv Handler of ETR Advisory and Shane Henley, who's Head of Monitoring Solutions at CubeLogic. And the topic of the discussion is going to be trade surveillance software, where the market is and where it's going. So without further ado, let's get straight into the topic and welcome my guests, Aviv Handler and Shane Henley. Thanks for joining us on CTRMRadio today. And I'd like to start off by asking you both, really, but maybe start with Aviv. Just give us a little bit of background to get started on the need and regulations around and for trade surveillance in energy and commodities, please.
So, trade surveillance has been required in principle for quite some time. We go and trade in the markets. We don't want to break any anti-abuse rules, so therefore trade surveillance is something that would help to mitigate us doing something or a company doing something that might be seen as abuse. On the regulatory side, the requirement to carry out surveillance, or actually not surveillance necessarily, but effective monitoring, started with MiFID, which came into force in 2016. So until then, if you were not a regulated firm in particular, there was no offence of improper monitoring. MiFID introduced the concept of proper monitoring, of effective monitoring, and required for the covered instruments, which are largely but not entirely financially settled instruments, to be monitored somehow. And it's left up to the market participant to work out the correct combination of processes, technology, training, and other things as well. So MiFID really introduced that concept on a regulatory basis, and that time of 2016 saw the start of widespread implementation of surveillance systems in energy, and that continued for several years. More recently, we've seen REMIT 2 come into force. REMIT is an anti-abuse regulation that applies to wholesale energy products, in particular gas and power, delivered in the EU, both physical and financial. And in effect, with some minor differences, that upgrades the requirement under REMIT to also require effective monitoring. So for some market participants in gas and power, that's most things that are done. So now there is a regulatory requirement to carry out effective monitoring over all of our activity. And now we're seeing another raise in the level of surveillance and effective monitoring carried out by market participants.
Okay. Shane, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Aviv's characteristically complete and concise answer. I would say it's interesting to see how the industry has evolved over that period. So, if I think back to 2016, when many energy and commodity firms that did trade a few financial instruments, so for example, anybody trading on an exchange like ICE Futures Europe or EEX, we're starting to realize that they did have this obligation. I saw firsthand many firms trying to figure out, well, what exactly do we have to surveil, and can we keep some of this perhaps out of scope? And I think that probably represents one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing now under REMIT 2, where many firms had sort of elected to cover what they were effectively legally obligated to. So as Aviv says, financial instruments, and these are defined under the MiFID regulation. And are now starting to have to move towards surveilling the physical aspect of the market as well. And I think that does represent the biggest shift. Now, of course, many just being good citizen-minded firms have opted to cover both, or largely opted to cover both. But now, of course, that option in many respects is being replaced by regulatory obligations, as Viv alluded to.
So my understanding is that there are a number of solutions came to market, but some of them really came in from the financial side and maybe don't quite cut it from an energy and commodities perspective. So can you explain how the energy and commodities side is different to the financial market in terms of both the anti-abuse measures and also in terms of perhaps what the tools being deployed have to do?
Shall I pick this one up, Aviv? Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the nature of energy and commodity markets are fundamentally different from many standpoints. So, I mean, starting at the most basic level, I think if you just look at the nature of contracts traded on these markets, unlike an equity, for example, which is a perpetual instrument, if you like, many energy and commodity instruments have expiry dates, so they exist for a period of time and then they disappear. There's obviously the nature of the underlying for these contracts. So you will have, let's take a more complex variety, which is power markets. You will have contracts traded in futures markets that then move all the way up to the physical delivery part of a particular delivery period. So, you will start trading a quarter hour or hour implicitly 4 or 5 years ahead in some cases. And then positions will need to be balanced right up to that point of delivery. And then you have a added complexity of what happens after delivery. So effectively, we talk about gate closure, that period between, when the market at large is now no longer open for trading and the system operator has to then balance that market. There's also considerations for surveillance around that. Then naturally underpinning all of that, there are physical assets as well, which need to be considered, and some very unique specificities that are quite unique to these markets. So things like transmission or transportation of gas and power. Of course, when you start talking about European coupled power markets, there's just a whole new sleuth of complexity that comes along with that. And I think what that fundamentally translates into is that you have some very unique characteristics of these markets. Markets differ from a sort of a very fundamental product level. But then it all really translates into what is the technical challenge for monitoring that. And that really does come down to, in many cases, a data question. And how do you handle that data? How do you represent that data? Then how ultimately do you do something intelligent with that data, which might yield, suspicious behavior as envisaged under these regulations? And I think when you're coming at this from a perspective of, say, equities or bond markets, trying to apply just those plain principles, although many of them still are relevant when you talk about certain patterns of behavior. But when you start getting into the weeds, as it were, it really is a very, very different market. And if your system isn't fundamentally geared towards those markets, I think you're going to find yourself struggling.
How is REMIT 2 impacting anti-abuse measures for energy market participants in particular? Maybe a bit.
So it's kind of linked to what I said before, where REMIT 2 really upgrades the requirement to carry out effective monitoring to the level that you have in MiFID. So under REMIT 1, only what we call PPATs, professional persons arranging transactions, were required to do monitoring. Doesn't mean people didn't do it. It's still a good idea if breaking those rules leads to a fine, but you couldn't be fined just for not monitoring. So in effect, REMIT 2 upgrades that to what we call professional persons executing transactions, and there's a bit of subtlety around that, so that there is now a requirement to monitor for breaches of, it states actually Articles 3, 4 and 5. So 3 is the insider trading requirement. 4, rather strangely, is the requirement to disclose, and there's a bit of complexity and sometimes confusion around what that means. And Article 5 is about market manipulation. So there's a requirement to carry out effective monitoring to make sure you don't break those rules. And there's a requirement in some cases to submit suspicious transaction or order reports in certain cases to national regulatory authorities. So that's the change that REMIT 2 made. It's now a regulatory requirement, whereas before it was best practice.
And what sort of teeth are we looking at for breaches of these regulations?
Well, who knows? We don't know yet. So these things always follow a life cycle. So it's a new regulation. We have not seen much guidance yet from ACER on how to implement that, although, of course, there's years of best practice in surveillance from elsewhere. So usually the way these things go is with a new rule, it beds in. Eventually, national regulatory authorities will perhaps start to check to make sure that there is adequate monitoring in places. And then where that's not accurate, they might introduce measures to improve it, which could either be a requirement to improve it. That's usually how it starts. Maybe at some point fines as well. If you look at MiFID, which has now been enforced for coming up to 9 years, We do see some fines, not that often, but sometimes from national competent authorities for ineffective monitoring. We actually saw one in Ireland not that long ago. We haven't seen many or possibly even any levied on non-financial firms, on energy firms, despite them being covered. But we do see effective monitoring fines sometimes under MiFID, usually on financial firms.
One of the things REMIT 2 does is it brings firstly into focus benchmark manipulation specifically. So that is now explicitly included as a market manipulation area. And it also puts quite a lot of focus on LNG. Obviously now the heightened role that LNG is playing in European energy mix is critical, particularly following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the significant reduction in Russian pipeline gas. So it does bring those two into scope, but it also implicitly brings other areas under the surveillance spotlight, which I think were previously not particularly well considered. So, for example, things like auction surveillance, monitoring the SDAC and SIDC markets. So that's the day ahead and intraday coupled markets in Europe. These are now specifically named inside the actual text of the regulation, making it very clear there's an expectation to monitor these markets. There's also, I think, a latent expectation that firms should be doing something around balancing markets as well. And I'd be interested to hear Aviv's view on this, given that the article under REMIT 2 under Article 15, which does require the surveillance for PPETs, does make it clear that it should only be data that is publicly available or available to the PPET itself. But balancing markets, I think, really does represent quite a step up in terms of complexity, in terms of monitoring them, given that it isn't a normal market in any real sense of the word, and the way that you would monitor it does differ from how you would, say, monitor an open order book on an exchange like EPEX or Nord Pool.
Okay, good. So let's have Aviv's view on that.
Yes, so balancing does introduce something interesting. So, because we have already seen fines for breaches of Article 5 of REMIT in the balancing markets. And I would say that when we've seen those fines, we've sometimes, I don't know about being surprised, but it's been new territory. It's been new territory, and the fines partly depend on the region in which the fine is levied, because there's different balancing rules there in different places. For example, it's different in Germany to other places. But it's been a challenge sometimes for firms to avoid those fines and to work out what isn't allowed under REMIT. The same with other areas as well. So monitoring for that is challenging, especially when you don't have all of the data. And as Shane said, there isn't necessarily always a requirement sometimes to monitor where there is no data available. So we will have to see how that develops. I think REMIT 1 and 2 are full of areas where we're not quite sure how they're going to develop, especially in terms of the definition of abuse. So another example of that is capacity hoarding or transmission or generation withholding or those sorts of things. They're all emerging sciences even now, as is what is abuse and how to monitor for it. Balancing is the same. So I think we'll be focusing more and more on that over the years. Similarly, there is a requirement coming to report balancing data, although it's not clear to me who reports that. But even that's a challenge as well. So I can see many interesting years ahead in working out how to make sure that the balancing markets work effectively as per REMIT.
And on that point, actually, Aviv, I was talking to a system operator recently, and they were complaining that ASA failed to specify the format that this balancing data should be reported in, although I think it's subsequently been perhaps clarified in the recent consultation report. But
yes, the final format
that was very thought through.
Yes, and the final format, I guess, will come out in the implementing act, the new implementing act that's due quite soon.
Well, I was going to ask, how do you deal with these uncertainties? Because it seems to me it's always been a feature of the regulatory markets that things require ironing out in practice. How does that process happen, and how do you see the market addressing all of this?
Should I go first? So with regulatory uncertainty, I mean, again, it's always been there. I think there is something quite particular in REMIT, not new for REMIT 2, which is that there are forms of market abuse where we're not quite sure how to define them, and so sometimes we are surprised at certain fines or at certain statements from some regulators and some regulatory actions. So how do you deal with that, given that you don't necessarily always know whether what you're doing is allowed or not. All you can do is mitigate it. So there's various ways of doing that. One is that's what I explain to traders in training. It's that if you are if you have a particular practice, you need to properly document what you think is and isn't allowed, and the traders should stick to it. And what I say is, if traders are sticking to the policy that is arrived at through a useful analysis of that policy, then the companies come to a view which may be agreed or disagreed with by a regulator. But then if a member of staff follows that policy, then you're following it as a company, and you're not going out and being a rogue trader. So should there be a regulatory inquiry, you're following a company policy, which has hopefully been arrived at following a reasonable thought process around those rules. Now, sometimes that might not be the same as what the regulator comes up with, but it's not quite rogue. It means that you disagree, which can happen, and that's how you mitigate the risk. And then every now and then you review those policies in the light of new cases and new regulatory information and new things that come out. That's, I would say, how you mitigate that.
Right. I would add to that and say that I think there certainly is a virtue to knowing where the herd is. Not to use that as a pejorative, but there certainly is a sort of an aspect of group behavior, and you don't want to be too far away from where the rest of the herd is. So it was quite interesting during that period from 2016 when many energy and commodity firms were starting to adopt surveillance, the sort of those that were at the bow wave versus those that were at the stern, some not wanting to make that large investment in these types of compliance programs versus those who are all too keen to invest in that, and just seeing sort of where you fit in terms of your regulatory risk appetite as an organization, where you fit in that herd. But where you don't want to be is separated entirely from it. So, the market is very good at establishing its own norms and best practices. Obviously there's a lot of very effective working groups out there where information is exchanged and consensus is reached. So just making sure that you're not entirely separated from that, again, is a good benchmark, I think, to do every couple of months or years.
Well, I would imagine you're also impacted by the uncertainties of vendor trying to bring software to market. So do you deal with it in a similar way? How do you deal with that uncertainty from a vendor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously we have a great group of customers who are very able and willing to input into some of the questions that we have when these vagaries do exist. I think there's a very good running example in this at the moment. So, REMIT 2 introduces a few new challenges, as we've already mentioned, around balancing, but also around capacity hoarding. So, all of a sudden, things like cross-border wash trades, etc., are going to become something which is expected to be monitored. Now, I think whilst the regulators have issued a lot of guidance and a lot of augmenting insights into what they expect around monitoring for this type of behavior, or what that behavior constitutes, there hasn't been that sort of insight provided over, for example, balancing market abuse. So what do you do in those circumstances? Well, you can, either do nothing, or you can take an informed view, discuss it with your users and build up a reasonable proxy about what they believe firms should be doing, and then follow that until the best guidance comes out. And that's always, as a firm, that's always the question that we're grappling with. What do we do first? How do we prioritize this? And how do we give the coverage where the maximum certainty is held at that particular moment? But it's certainly not easy. And, when there are these big regulatory changes like REMIT 2, there's a lot that has to happen broadly at the same time. So it really is a case of all hands to get through these quite stiff work programs.
Right, thank you. One of the other things that intrigues me is this idea of surveilling communications. So what role does that communication surveillance play in anti-abuse measures?
Should I take that first? So communication surveillance is the next line of defense. Certainly, if you go to financial institutions, certainly the larger ones, there will be some form of communication surveillance which can get quite advanced. First of all, so there's two things I have to say about that. First of all, from a regulatory perspective, do we require communication surveillance? There is a requirement for recording of all communication sometimes. For example, under REMIT UK, or if you are an investment firm, you have to keep records of all communications. Not so in other cases. There is only an explicit requirement to do communication surveillance insofar as it's effective monitoring, in the same way as transaction surveillance. Because again, there is no requirement to do transaction surveillance. The requirement is to do effective monitoring, where we start with transaction surveillance, but actually you could argue that communication surveillance is also part of that. So that's the should we do it? How do you do it? I would say communication surveillance, like transaction surveillance, is its own world, where there are basic and very advanced types of surveillance. And I would say that carrying out effective communication surveillance is, in some respects, even harder than transaction surveillance. Why? First of all, getting the data, that's part one. So what data are we talking about? We're talking about all communications. So that's emails, voice calls, messaging, all of that sort of thing. How do you do effective surveillance? You need to be able to ingest all of that data, and also, if you're being very careful about it, work out whether there's any data missing. So, a real rogue trader is going to use, for example, something called a burner phone. If they know that the communications is being surveilled and they're any good at being a rogue trader, they'll go off and communicate another way. So an advanced communication surveillance system would be able to work out that there's something funny going on, and that actually these communications have disappeared, or there's an unusual pattern, etc. So getting the data is hard, and the non-data, and then doing things with those data is hard as well. So you do have systems that just look for keywords and things like that, in various combinations, but even that's quite hard. People use different languages, different slangs. Communications aren't always that clear, and genuinely not that clear, especially with voice. It's hard. I'd say the ultimate holy grail is correlating the two. So carrying out integrated surveillance across communication and transaction, that's hard to do as well. So I'd say it's the next step. Again, as always, the energy industry lags the banking industry. In the banking industry, some very advanced things have been done on the comms side, but it's more difficult and it's expensive.
Sounds like another use case for AI, potentially.
Yes, and it is being used by some. Yeah.
Anything to add on that, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say also there's a bit of a horses for courses question there as well. I mean, if you take short-term power trading in Europe, for example, we know that this has got a very high degree of algorithmic trading penetration. It's obviously mostly or almost exclusively exchange-based. So in that type of scenario, I would question whether voice and e-coms is really all that significant. I mean, obviously, there's always potential cases you could conceive of, around collusion, etc. But by and large, I would say it's probably far less relevant for those types of markets than it would be, for example, fairly fragmented but highly voice brokered gas markets, where there obviously is a lot of communication going on, and there's also a fair amount of bilateral activity as well. So I think sort of deciding where you apply it as well is a question. I think the question about where these two converge is a very interesting one, and it's one that we've been considering for a while. The fundamental question is, do you build an open architecture to allow yourself to integrate with a existing service provider on the other side of the fence? So if you're a trades and orders based surveillance vendor like we are, do you allow yourself to be plugged into by a voice and e-coms vendor and vice versa? And then, if you do that, do both have the, I guess, the ability to trigger alerts, or is one the sort of lead solution, the other being almost a corroborating solution, feeding off the other's alerts, or do both? And that does introduce a lot of interesting questions about how this would function, and whether or not you would have, I guess, the capacity to handle both, and also the technical ability to map these two things together. I think one of the inherent challenges is getting this timestamping right and getting these aligned between two systems like that. And obviously timestamps are everything when it comes to this type of surveillance, and getting that lined up, I don't think is always a straightforward technical issue.
No. So given the sort of last several years and where it's going, where else could this sort of anti-abuse regulation and monitoring go? And is the journey ever complete, I guess? Aviv?
Well, is any journey ever complete? The regulatory journey, I always thought it would be a wave, but it doesn't seem to have ended yet.
I remember you and I having discussions about how long your role as an analyst in regulatory would last.
Yeah,
you had a short.
I thought it'd be 5 years.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. So similarly with anti-abuse technology, is the journey ever complete? We'll see. Probably not. But these things evolve with the markets. So there will come a time where we surveil as best as possible. Again, anti-abuse activity is a question of probability. You can never guarantee that no trader will ever carry out any abusive practice. What you can do is mitigate against it. So you can mitigate against it to the tail of the distribution, so to speak. You'll never get rid of it. But the way that the rules and therefore the facilities will evolve is alongside the market. So the energy markets are changing. There's all sorts of redesigns being talked about. No doubt that will lead to new ways in which we need to surveil for abuse, because it will be open to new types of abuse as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that process just evolves with the market.
Indeed. I mean, I think a lot of these things as well are, besides the big macro forces, new regulations like REMIT 2 coming into effect. I think an interesting one, Aviv, is this recent EU Commission announcement of the action plan for affordable energy, where all of a sudden a task force is going to be formed to focus exclusively on European gas markets, and where ACER is being invoked, and possible closer ties to the MiFID regulation as well, to make sure that, whilst they've resisted the urge for price caps, they are wanting to put a higher emphasis on market integrity. So that type of thing can have very direct effects on how and what firms are doing. Likewise, I think if you go down to more granular level, the regulatory authorities themselves are constantly learning. They're getting better equipped with data and data handling. And many are procuring systems or developing systems to do this type of surveillance. And obviously precedent, so enforcement precedent, is a big informer of what firms believe they should be looking for. So, as long as there are enforcement cases that are bringing up slightly different perspectives on perhaps the same question, or bringing more clarity on things which have been long understood to be one thing but now might mean another thing, there's always going to be a need to adapt systems and processes to keep up with that change. So I think a long answer short, I think this journey probably isn't going to be complete, provided there is market abuse regulation around.
Right. Which brings us probably to the last question, and this is primarily aimed at you, I guess, Shane, is thinking about where you're at with your product. How do you see your product evolving? What do you have in store from a roadmap point of view, and what would you like to say about it in general, I guess?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, it's dealing with the known knowns, as it were. So the big challenges which firms are facing, particularly under regulations like REMIT 2. Monitoring markets like the SIDC, it's not straightforward. Huge data volumes that you have to deal with at minute granularity, and making sense of this in an effective and efficient way, and also importantly in a cost-effective way, is absolutely crucial. So whilst we've been doing that for a while, there's always room for improvement, and indeed this is what we're focusing on, as well as bringing into scope all of the sort of REMIT 2 add-ons, so your auction surveillance, your cross-border wash trades and implicit capacity hoarding, and then ultimately balancing markets as well. I think alongside that, there's obviously some big moving parts that can't be ignored in the market. You mentioned it earlier, artificial intelligence. This is obviously now driving, I think, some very interesting use cases in a lot of areas. LLMs are certainly able and capable of helping compliance to make sense of large amounts of data and putting it into slightly more digestible form. So weaving in these AI use cases is certainly a big focus on our longer term roadmap, given that we've never really been the early adopters on the hype cycle, but I think now it's quite established that AI has got some legs, and is certainly going to be something which is enduring and is going to form a big part of the future of these types of tools. I think the second element, of course, is looking at this question about where do voice and e-coms and orders and trades-based solutions come together. I think there are a few schools of thought on this. One being, do you buy a solution that is integrated, being able to cover both of these? Is that the future? Or do firms have their sort of preferred specialists in each of these areas? And this is, of course, particularly relevant for us because we've spent many, many years and a lot of time getting this physical energy market surveillance question right. Voice and e-coms, I think, brings a completely new discipline, certainly a completely new technology approach. And do firms then have their favorites? And they say, well, I don't want to get rid of my X system for Y. I would rather have one integrate into the other. And that goes back to the point we were discussing earlier about, do you have an open architecture? And if so, how does that work practically, and where do these two systems meet? So I think broadly that's it. I think obviously, learning to walk before you can run is the fundamental question many firms are dealing with. I call this the double step. When we talk to a lot of firms that move to us that are coming from another vendor solution, we often talk about the challenge of monitoring a market like EPEX or Nord Pool as being the first challenge, and then the second challenge being, this high degree of automated surveillance, of automated trading, so algo trading, for example. So just getting on top of those fairly fundamental parts of surveillance and the REMIT 2 is certainly the immediate focus, and that's certainly what we'll be looking at over the next year.
And it seems to me you've been doing quite well with the product in the marketplace. Is that correct? Quite a lot of demand for this kind of product?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the big shift has obviously been trying to monitor these short-term physical power markets in particular. I think they do just represent a significant ratchet up in terms of complexity and data volume. I think this has been the big shock over the last few years with the sort of exponential effect that the shared order book under the expert market brings huge amounts of data, in a fairly complex way, in the sense that you can have, hours, half hours, quarter hours, all potentially trading over the same delivery period. And just having to handle this data and then make sense of it, it's a non-trivial challenge. It's just not something that can be done on spreadsheets anymore. You have to have a reasonably sophisticated technology and, I think, sort of conceptual approach to handling it from a surveillance point of view. And that's indeed where we specialise.
Well, with that, I'll say, Aviv, Shane, thank you very much for joining CTRMRadio.
Thank you.
I think that was a very informative session. And thanks a lot.
Thank you both.